Happy draft day to all of those who celebrate. And there is one certain NFLSU hopeful, a first round draft hopeful, that has kind of been in a positional battle of which cornerback will be taken first, Sauce Gardner or Derek Stingley Jr. We brought in a friend of the podcast, Alex Frank, host of Locked on Bearcats, to break down the two cornerbacks. And also, he has plenty of experience with Brian Kelly, with Mike Denbrock, with the new members of his LSU coaching staff, his impressions of their tenure at Cincinnati, all of that and more on today's edition of Locked on LSU.
You are Locked on LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every day. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, more odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Caroline Fenton, host of Locked on LSU, and I am your host every day. And I'm joined today by a friend of the podcast, Alex Frank, the host of Locked on Bearcats. Now, Alex, I was on your show on Locked on Bearcats earlier this week, and you can catch that both on the Locked on LSU YouTube pages and the Locked on Cincinnati pages as well. And we discussed who will be the first cornerback taken in this draft. Of course, this is a very defensive-heavy draft. You've got Tavon Walker, you've got Kayvon Thibodeau, you've got Aiden Hutchinson, all these pass rushers that are expected to go, if not 1, 2, 3, in the top 5, in the top 10. But you've also got these two corners, these two very elite corners that are expected to go, not just in the first round, but top 5, top 10, top 15. I gave you my impression of, the two corners who I think will be taken. I said that I think Derek Stingley is the better cornerback of the two, of course, by a slim margin because they're both certified ball hawks. But I said that I thought Sauce Gardner would be taken first in the draft because I know Derek Stingley is coming off of 2 back-to-back injured seasons. He hasn't had the same production in the past 2 seasons that he's had in 2019. And I think any NFL general manager would be a little bit leery about picking that player, top 5, top 10, top 15, whatever it might be. But I want your thoughts on it, since you know Sauce Gardner better than I think us LSU fans do. Your take, who do you think is the better corner? Which corner do you think will be taken first, the first corner taken off the board in this draft tonight?
Well, Caroline, first off, thank you for having me on your show today. It definitely is an honor. And this is a debate that has a little more validity to it than I thought it did, because as we talked about on Locked on Bearcats earlier this week, I was like, wait, Derek Stingley Jr. could go ahead of Sauce Gardner? What? Well, okay, there's some merit to this, but I'm going to take Sauce Gardner because he's more durable. Availability is the best ability. And I'll compare this to a debate that was somewhat present for a while in Cincinnati 3 years ago. There was a thing, Caroline, in Cincinnati, hashtag tank for Tua. There was a time when Tua Tagovailoa was the Bengals' top, or which quarterback the Bengals most sought after in the draft. And I'm like, wait a second. Tua's injury prone. Let's look at what this kid Joe Burrow is doing down at LSU. Well, that was before Tua's hip injury. So I wanted Joe Burrow when I always tell people I wanted Joe Burrow when Tua's ankle was injured, not his hip. So let's go to this. Sauce Gardner versus Derek Stingley. I'm taking Sauce Gardner because he has played a majority of the last 2 seasons. He's got more exposure. There's been more talk about him because he's actually been on the field. And Caroline, who would not want a player who did not allow a touchdown throughout his college career? I understand he played in the American Athletic Conference. I understand the best receivers don't come from that conference necessarily, unless your name is Gabriel Davis and you have 4 touchdowns in the playoffs against the Chiefs. But you don't allow a touchdown for 3 seasons. And I'll point this out. Sauce Gardner was sixth on the depth chart going into the 2019 season. And by the 5th game of the season, he was the starting corner. In fact, Luke Fickell just mentioned on an interview podcast that I listened to last weekend that he didn't think Sauce Gardner could start when he first came into Cincinnati. And he admitted he was wrong. Okay, so after that 5th game in 2019, he goes on to be freshman All-American. Maybe that was a fluke in some people's eyes. You don't really know how he's going to evolve or come off of that accolade, but he just got better and better and better. But I do think this. I think if Sauce Gardner, let's say he is passed over by Derek Stingley Jr., I think that's the best case scenario for Sauce. And I'll tell you why. Sauce Gardner's already been humbled by being sixth on the depth chart. When you come from where he comes from Detroit. He's a hard worker. He has a passion for the game. He's humble. He is incredibly tough. He has that he has that Midwestern toughness ingrained in him. Caroline, you and I both know that, being from the Midwest. Mm-hmm. So I think if he's passed over by Derek Stingley, he's going to take that personally. And I think he's going to work that much harder. So it's a debate that has way more validity than I ever thought it would. I admit I was surprised when I first heard that. It was NFL Network's Good Morning Football. They did a mock draft last week where Stingley Jr. was chosen first over Gardner, and I was surprised. Now, am I a little biased here? Maybe, because I'm the host of a daily Bearcats podcast, but I just think Sauce has been on the field way more than Stingley Jr., and I'm taking him first off the board. It's a sure thing because, yes, Derek Stingley is immensely talented. I know that because he was on that 2019 LSU team, which I watched a lot because the Bengals ultimately have now 2 players, actually 3 players from that team. So I think Stingley's going to be a great corner in the NFL if he stays healthy. I know you've compared him to you've mentioned that he's been compared to Stephon Gilmore, which is a very, very high comparison. But Sauce Gardner being compared to Richard Sherman, and we know Richard Sherman, when he was in his prime, was otherworldly, shut down. I mean, there was a game in 2014, Aaron Rodgers did not throw his way once. I'll put it to you that way. And everybody listening that way. So I'm taking Sauce for the reason that he's more durable, he's been on the field longer, and it's more of a sure thing, especially when you don't allow a touchdown for 3 years.
And I think that's a very valid point because that's always what I say. Your best ability is your availability. And, if I'm an NFL general manager and I'm investing premium draft stock into a player, you want to make sure that, you're not just drafting them for 1 year, you're drafting them for their full rookie contract, you're drafting them for the future. And if they can't hold up, then you're investing premium stock into, something that doesn't have longevity. But I'll put it to you this way as well, because I think that you have to look at the kinds of teams that could be drafting these two, because I think there are 2 very different types of teams. There are teams that are very much so in win now mode. So I would look at, the Jacksonville Jaguars, for example. I think that franchise has been so starved for wins and success that I feel like, any sort of, a winning season or maybe even a playoff season for Jacksonville would be immensely successful. So Jacksonville is in win now mode. Or teams that may be in a Super Bowl window. But I kind of throw those out because, of course, those teams would be in win now mode if they have the depth to be able to win the Super Bowl, but they probably wouldn't even be in the proximity of Sauce Gardner or Derek Stingley Jr. But then I also look at other franchises who may be picking toward the top, who may not necessarily be in win now mode, maybe more of a rebuild mode, so they could afford a player that hasn't played, this past season, or could afford a player that's recovering from an injury. I look at the Houston Texans, for example. I don't think anyone's looking at Houston and saying Houston has to win now, because Houston doesn't have their answer at quarterback. Of course, they just picked up some picks from Cleveland in the Deshaun Watson trade. But I don't think anyone is putting pressure on Houston to have a really, really successful season now. New coach, quarterback that they drafted last year. He may or may not be their long-term solution at quarterback. So I don't think Houston's in win now mode. So if you're not in win now mode, then you could look at Derek Stingley and you could look at Sauce Gardner. And although Sauce Gardner may be more of a sure thing, Derek Stingley is definitely more of a question mark, but I think has shown more in college than Sauce Gardner has, albeit 2 years ago. Because I'll look at the NFL draft breakdown. NFL.com did a breakdown of every player in the draft, saying that, Sauce Gardner, his weaknesses is that he could be a little bit small. He can draw a lot of penalties. He could be sloppy at times. The only con for Derek Stingley is that, like you said, he hasn't been available. He's been injured and he hasn't been able to produce the past couple of years. So I guess my question for you is, kind of put yourself in the mindset of an NFL general manager. If you're not in win now mode, then would you take the better corner of the two? And I guess, Which do you think is the better corner of the two, availability aside?
That's a very interesting question, but I'm still going to take Sauce Gardner because I don't think a corner like him comes around very often. A corner that does not allow a touchdown for 3 years, and I don't think that stat can be said enough. When you say it, you're wowed by it, but the fact that he not only did that, but also did not allow a reception of 20 yards last season, and again, he did play in the American Athletic Conference. That's not his fault. That's Cincinnati. Just, he didn't play at Cincinnati when they're going to be joining the Big 12 in 2023. I'm still taking, if I have the opportunity, because LSU cornerbacks get pumped out ridiculously. I mean, we've seen so many of them come through.
DBU.
Oh, absolutely, DBU. And it's also apparently wide receiver university too. So I'm taking Sauce Gardner because this is a rare opportunity for me. And I still think he's in a developmental phase, Caroline, because as you mentioned, he is still small. You look at NFL corners, and I like my corners to be I like them to be big, physical, because there are some pretty physical freaks at wide receiver in the National Football League. You know that. I mean, you have one in Nashville and A.J. Brown. So I want my corner. I think Sauce Gardner can, they can beef him up in the weight room to whichever team he goes to. I think if he gets drafted, I mean, you mentioned Houston. They're not necessarily in a win-now mode. They're in a developmental phase, right? Mm-hmm. So he goes to Houston, which I'm going to say it on the record. I would not necessarily, as a Bearcats fan, I want him to go to a franchise that's well run. Houston's not necessarily that. But at the same time, you have an opportunity to develop. You can become a face of the franchise where there's not really one right now. So I'm taking Sauce Gardner because this is rare that you have a corner who did not allow a touchdown in 3 years. He performed well in big games against Memphis a handful of times. He performed well against Notre Dame, had an interception that swayed the momentum of the game early. And then against Alabama on the biggest of stages in the college football playoff, he did not allow Jameson Williams to really do much of anything. 7 receptions, 62 yards. Yeah, it's not 0 for 0, but it's still limiting.
It's not up to the standard that we've seen Jameson Williams do in the past. Yeah.
Yes, a wide receiver who, if he hadn't gotten hurt, I think he would be a top 10 pick as well. So I'm taking Sauce. But then again, I don't think you can go wrong here with either corner. But what I've seen from Sauce Gardner the last 2 years, I've seen every game. I've seen shutdowns. I mean, there was a comment that Luke Fickell said that he's almost like he's getting bored playing corner because no one's throwing to him. So I'm taking him for those reasons.
Coming up next, I want to break down some of the mock drafts. I want to look at some of the sports books. What do they think about the Sauce Gardner versus Derek Stingley debate? We'll get into that with our friend Alex Frank. But before we do that, I want to tell you about BetOnline because BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your betting stats and sports information. And you can check out BetOnline today before the draft to put some bets on who do you think will go where and what position. And I'm looking at Sauce Gardner, for example. The over-under on him is 5.5. Take it how you want it. I would maybe take the under 5.5, but that's just my opinion. Hey, do it how you want to do it. And you can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information. They've got live betting, they've got playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Host of Locked On Bearcats, Alex Frank, friend of the show, joins us. We're talking about Derek Stingley versus Sauce Gardner. He's seen so much more of Sauce Gardner than I think we as LSU fans have. And of course, we've seen way more of Derek Stingley than probably many Bearcats fans have. But I'll look at some NFL draft mock drafts. Mel Kiper Jr., for example, Dane Brugler, people that I usually go to get, my best NFL draft information. I think it's interesting because I think that there are a few mock drafters that are kind of on the same page and then one outlier. And so earlier this week on the show that I host in Nashville, we did our full analysis and I had this grading scale and I did a full breakdown and I looked at the past 3 mock drafts and I looked at Dane Brugler, Todd McShay, Daniel Jeremiah, Mel Kiper, Peter King, a bunch of mock drafters, and I came up with this grading scale, and I compared their final mock drafts with the actual draft and see how it panned out to see which was the best mock drafter. And it was very intense research there for our show here in Nashville. But I broke it down, and Dane Brugler of The Athletic had the best mock drafts of the past 3 years. I looked at 2019, 2020, and 2021. So I looked at Dane Brugler, Todd McShay's, and Mel Kiper's mock draft. It's interesting because Todd McShay has Derek Stingley going 3 to Houston, Sauce Gardner 7 to the Giants. Mel Kiper has Sauce Gardner going first at 4 to the Jets. Derek Stingley a little bit later on 9 to the Seahawks. And of course, they're kind of predicting trades, thinking of who's going to move up where. And then I look at Dane Brugler, the person that I graded to have the best mock draft, and he had Sauce Gardner going first in the cornerback debate, not first overall, but 7th to the Giants, and Derek Stingley 9th to the Seahawks. Your first impression of these final mock drafts that are coming out from some of the NFL draft gurus?
Well, again, it just reaffirms that, from my perspective, that there's more debate to Stingley Jr. versus Sauce Gardner. But what's interesting, Caroline, is this. You mentioned Dane Brugler has the best, or you gave him the best grade of the 3. In his draft guide, The Beast, he has Sauce Gardner listed as his top
The Beast
corner.
is awesome.
Oh,
if anybody hasn't checked it out, The Beast on The Athletic, Dane Brugler has a lot of really great information.
I want to know how much time he spends on that every year, because it is the most in-depth. I mean, they talk about, their family, his family life. They talk about his upbringing. I mean, it's like, how many? 400 biographies in one guide. Okay. So what's interesting though, Caroline, is Dane Brugler doesn't even have Derek Stingley Jr. ranked number 2. He is Kyler Gordon, corner out of Washington. Now you could see both corners, Gordon and Trent McDuffie, come from the Huskies. But again, I like the fact that Sauce Gardner is ranked higher than Stingley Jr. in 2 of those draft guides. But at the same time, Todd McShay, who's got Stingley Jr. going 3rd, and then Sauce Gardner going 7th. That's interesting to me that they're kind of going far apart. But I think it's going to be really, really close. And again, I don't think you can miss on the corner that you take in this year's draft. I like the fact, again, I like the 2 of the 3 have Sauce Gardner ranked higher because, I think it's more of a sure thing. I think it's a safer pick because these talents like Sauce. I mean, first off, how many players are nicknamed Sauce?
Not many.
Past, present, and future. So this is a rare opportunity for teams to take a big swing. Now, there's also a big swing for taking Derek Stingley Jr.
Do you think it would be a big swing taking Sauce Gardner?
I do, because of the fact that he has not faced a lot of top-notch competition throughout his college career. And you mentioned that he's undersized. Again, I like my corners to be fully developed. Your best corners are coming from the SEC. This is a cornerback that was about 150 pounds when he came to Cincinnati. That's not it, and I'm not exaggerating.
That's not big at all.
Exactly. Now he's 6 foot. I think he's 6'3", 197, something like that. But it is a big swing when you're taking a guy like that because you're going from the American Athletic Conference to the National Football League. And Caroline, you and I both know the NFL is a whole lot faster than college football. Even in the SEC, you get to the NFL, the speed of the game is faster, the coverage is tighter. I think that's why you see a lot of great corners come from the SEC because they play in the best conference where there's NFL draft picks year in and year out. It is a big swing when you take on Sauce Gardner. And I've kind of thought that all along because of the fact that he plays in the American Athletic Conference, because most of your draft prospects that are ranked number 1 are coming from Power 5 conferences. You look at who's going to go number 1. He's either going to come from the SEC or the Big Ten, most likely. And you're going to have your top quarterback probably taken from the ACC. Now, then again, there are 2 quarterbacks who come from Group of 5 or independent schools. It is a big swing taking Sauce Gardner. I do believe that because you are taking a chance on him still developing into a shutdown corner. And I've kind of said this. It may be too good to be true that he did not allow a touchdown throughout his career, that he is the top cornerback on many people's draft boards, draft experts, and maybe on some teams. But again, does he have the experience? He played 3 years at Cincinnati. That's great. But I look at Derek Stingley Jr. and who he went up against in practice in his freshman season and the impact that he had in year one, very similar seasons, his 2019 and Gardner's 2021 season, as you've mentioned, it's a big swing either way. I do believe that.
I don't know if I can agree with you on the fact that it's a big swing. I do think that's a factor is difficulty of competition, because in the SEC you're really facing the best of the best on both sides of the ball. But I do think that while Sauce Gardner is coming from the AAC, that's a pretty high octane offensive conference. I always joke that in the the AAC, they don't play defense. It's just, they just run up the numbers. You look at UCF, you look at Memphis, they put up big time offensive numbers. And I think that, you look at Tony Pollard, for example, who's putting up big time numbers with the Dallas Cowboys, came from the University of Memphis. Those are, and of course, as a corner, you're not covering running backs, but just the first AAC player offensively that came to my head. Although I do agree with you that in the SEC, you're going to be facing really difficult competition. Defensively, in the AAC, you're going to be facing some pretty solid wide receivers. And of course, Cincinnati facing Alabama in the college football playoff, and even just getting to the college football playoff. And that's, and even, playing Notre Dame in the regular season, a team that was finished top 10 in the college football standings. So I do think that comes into play here. I do think in 2019, Derek Stingley Jr. faced much more difficult competition. It's not just the one college football playoff game against Alabama or the one Notre Dame game throughout the season. It was, you're looking at Auburn, Ole Miss, Alabama, Mississippi State, Texas A&M, Texas that year, some of the most difficult teams in the country. I don't know if I can call it a swing, because Sauce Gardner is such a talented player, level of competition or not. You could go toe-to-toe with Jameson Williams. And of course, he's not seeing those kinds of teams week in and week out. I can't say it's a swing.
Well, and you're right, Caroline. I think the AAC is a lot better in competition than some people might realize, maybe those in the SEC. And you hit on, a player, Tony Pollard, a dynamic running back from Memphis, and they've had some great wide receivers over the years. Some names that come to my mind, Devontae Coxie, Calvin Austin III. So, and then there's another running back who plays for Philadelphia in the NFC East, Kenneth Gainwell, comes from Memphis. So there are some wide receivers that, you look at East Carolina has produced Zay Jones. I know they've produced another one. I'm trying to think of his name. From UCF, Traequan Smith plays for the Saints. Yeah. So there are some talented wide receivers that come out of the American Athletic Conference. It is a conference that, yes, there are a lot of dynamic offenses. Memphis, when Mike Norvell was their head coach, they were putting up 40 points a game, 500 yards a game. We know UCF under Josh Heupel, they would put up 600 yards a game, and they run that, very spread offense, 5 wide. You have receivers literally lining up almost out of bounds. That's how far they stretch the field. So there is merit to that. But again, I look at the conference the last 2 years. It has gone down a little bit. UCF was not very good last year. Memphis had a down year last year. They had a down year in 2020. SMU was pretty solid last year. I'll give them that. Houston had 11 wins. Nathaniel Dell was a really good wide receiver.
Football team.
Yeah, that's a team that I think can give Cincinnati a run for their money this year as they try to go for a third straight conference championship. So you do face some competition in the American, but again, I just feel like a lot of people don't know about that competition. And maybe that, to your point, because people don't know, there is strong competition, because what's going to excite college football draft experts, observers, the casual college football fans is the SEC. And we've talked about the receivers Derek Stingley Jr. has faced. I still think it is a swing taking Sauce Gardner, because, again, you're taking a swing at a player who, yes, did not allow a touchdown throughout his career. And I don't care what conference you're in. You could be playing in the MAC, which is a terrible conference. No offense. And Russ Heldman has said that on my show before. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what conference you come from. You don't allow a touchdown, you're doing something really good. And you don't allow a 20-yard reception. And he faced some good wide receivers last year. I forget which wide receiver he covered against Notre Dame, because I was so focused on Michael Mayer and the Bearcats stopping him, their tight end. But he still rose to the occasion in big games. You go up against Jameson Williams, who we know when healthy can fly. and he held him to 7 for 62 in a game, Caroline, where John Mechie III didn't play. So you knew Jameson Williams was going to be their primary pass catcher, or so we thought, which I could go on about that whole game, and Alabama completely changing the game plan on the Bearcats. But it is still a swing to me because you're banking on him taking what he did in college. And if any team, whichever fan base of the team that drafts Sauce Gardner, if they expect Sauce Gardner to not allow a touchdown for 10 years, I'm sorry, that's probably not going to happen. You have to be realistic.
I don't think that's going to be the case.
when you have that coming in and you have that accomplishment and you have that expectation, that's only going to set you up to be let down. So you have to temper your expectations. This is the NFL. I mean, Sauce Gardner might struggle his first season. He's not going to do what he did in college. He's not going to be perfect in the NFL. I mean, I think a lot of us in Cincinnati were frustrated that perhaps Joe Burrow wasn't playing as well at a certain point in his rookie season with the Bengals because he was coming off that amazing LSU season. You thought he was perfect. Well, he didn't complete 100% of his passes, and he threw some interceptions, and he had an interception problem at the start of last season. So I think we were kind of like, well, was he the right draft pick? Should we have drafted Justin Herbert? I heard some of that.
Well, but I mean, at that point, in the 2020 season, you're looking at an offensive line issue. You're looking at, what kind of pass catchers does Joe Burrow really have? I think that we've seen, the value of adding a wide receiver like Ja'Marr Chase, not just with a wide receiver that he has an automatic connection with, but with a wide receiver that he can trust, with a wide receiver as talented as Ja'Marr Chase. And I actually do want to ask you about Joe Burrow and Cincinnati and how Ja'Marr Chase and how that connection is going, because fairly well. I also want to ask you about LSU's new coaching staff and your experience with them. So we'll get into that coming up next. Alex of Locked On Bearcats with us. First and foremost, Alex, we've got a quarterback competition going on in Baton Rouge. There are 4 quarterbacks in this quarterback room. We've got the certified veteran who's been with LSU for 6 years, Miles Brennan. We saw him in the spring game, and he looked calm, cool, and collected in the pocket. Doesn't really do anything sexy, but, he'll dink and dunk and move the sticks down the field, get a gain of 2 or 3 yards there. And he's reliable, and he can protect the football. We have Jaden Daniels, the Arizona State transfer who started with the Sun Devils for the past 3 seasons. And what we saw in the spring game was he's really talented with his legs. He can really move around. He's an incredibly mobile quarterback. Of course, it's the spring game, so you're not going to be facing a defense that's, rushing the quarterback and trying to attack the quarterback and stop the run as much as they would in the spring game, but definitely showed a lot of what he can do with his legs. Then there's Garrett Nussmeier, who is kind of a younger guy, is a redshirt freshman, who what we saw in the spring game was incredibly accurate. He led all quarterbacks in passing yards, and he can do a little bit more of those risky throws. He can throw the deep ball. He can throw it in double coverage. And, of course, there's Walker Howard as well, the true freshman coming in to LSU for his first season, an early enrollee in the spring. So kind of that breakdown of those quarterbacks. You are very familiar with Mike Denbrock, who came from the University of Cincinnati as their offensive coordinator, now the offensive coordinator at LSU. Hearing the breakdown of those quarterbacks, which do you think would fit Mike Denbrock's system best?
If it's possible to marry 2 quarterbacks that have different skill sets, that's what I would go with, because what I saw from Desmond Ritter, okay, so he was Mike Denbrock's quarterback for 4 years. And Desmond Ritter early on, Caroline, if his first read wasn't there, he'd take off and run. Now, he got better.
That's what we've heard a lot about Jaden Daniels as well.
Yes. Okay. So maybe Jaden Daniels and what you can do. How many years of eligibility does Jaden Daniels have at LSU, Caroline?
2, I believe.
Okay. So he has 2 years.
Maybe 1 or 2. Yeah.
Okay. Let's hope he has 2, because I think they can make him into a dual threat quarterback. If his first read's not there, you got to go through your progressions. That's what Desmond Ritter got really good at throughout his Bearcats career. That's why he had such a successful second half of 2020 and a really good 2021 season. And first off, I think Mike Denbrock is a fantastic hire by Brian Kelly. Why? Because I'm sure you know this. He coached Denbrock under Brian Kelly at Notre Dame. And Notre Dame, Brian Kelly, when he was there, had 7 10-win seasons, 5 straight to end his career. So very familiar with Mike Denbrock, and you saw the success that he had at Cincinnati. You take in a quarterback in Desmond Ritter, who maybe people don't know a lot about. Heck, Desmond Ritter only had 2 offers coming out of high school. So he developed into not just from a run first quarterback to a true dual threat quarterback. It became where it used to be if his first read wasn't there, he was going to take off and run. Then it became if he went through his progressions, nothing was there, he was going to extend plays with his legs, and make plays that way. So based on what you're telling me, I think Jaden Daniels would be their best option. And you talk about having experience at Arizona State, which, I mean, if you have experience starting as a quarterback in the Pac-12, that should mean a lot. Now, Miles Brennan obviously has experience too, but LSU the last 2 years, Caroline, they've been around 500. They went to a bowl game last year, if my memory serves me right. But okay, but I think if you want to get back to LSU football of the 2000s and of 2019 and any other great era of LSU football, I would take Jaden Daniels. You need a dynamic quarterback. I mean, even Nick Saban has been producing dynamic quarterbacks. Bryce Young, Tua Tagovailoa, Jalen Hurts. He's been having these dual threat quarterbacks come through, and Alabama's offense has become much more versatile. It's entered the modern college football offense of being just a spread offense. We're going to throw the ball. We're going to go up tempo. So I would take Jaden Daniels because I think Mike Denbrock can develop him into being a true dual threat quarterback, not just a quarterback that if his first read is not there, I'm panicking, I'm going to run, play's going to break down. No, the play hasn't broken down yet. You just haven't gone through your progressions. That's one area where Desmond Ritter really got better at his 4 years at Cincinnati. And I think what you're also going to see with Mike Denbrock is an emphasis of tight ends. Look at the tight ends that have come through Notre Dame under Brian Kelly. Kyle Rudolph, Tyler Eifert, Cole Kmet. Just recently, Michael Mayer is going to be an NFL draft prospect eventually. Durham Smythe, who I believe plays for the Miami Dolphins. So there are tight ends that have come through Notre Dame and Cincinnati. Josiah DeGuara, Josh Wiley, Leonard Taylor, Bruno LaBelle. And Cincinnati had a handful of tight ends under Brian Kelly, most notably Travis Kelce, plays for the Kansas City Chiefs, Brent Selleck, Garrett Selleck. There's going to be an emphasis on tight ends. I know tight ends might not seem like a huge deal in college football. Yes, they are. If you can incorporate them in your passing game, and as you evolve Jaden Daniels, Caroline, what's a quarterback security blanket in the NFL? Or forget the NFL, in football in general?
His legs?
Well, yes, his legs, but also I'm talking about in the passing game. Sorry to put you on the spot. A tight end. Okay. So,
and that's something that I've broken down plenty of times is how Brian Kelly loves those tight ends. So Notre Dame is not tight end you for no reason at all. And it's interesting because that is a fairly shallow position group for LSU. It's something that I've been looking on in the transfer portal, seeing how they can kind of boost up that tight end room because Jack Besh, who was such an electric player for LSU last year, will be transitioning to more of a wide receiver role. And, you mentioned Miles Brennan. He wasn't the starting quarterback for the entirety of the past 2 seasons since he left in 2020 with injury, in 2021 with injury as well. But I think that you do make a very fair point because so much of what I've heard about Jaden Daniels, there have been so many crossovers between Jaden Daniels and Desmond Ritter, which of course Desmond Ritter is a product of Mike Denbrock. So it should be very interesting, but a really interesting quarterback controversy on our hands. And it's not a bad problem to have, but I mean, it's a problem nonetheless. But Alex, I appreciate you so much. And good luck to your Sauce, and good luck to our Derek Stingley Jr. tonight in the NFL draft.
And I'll add, if you don't mind, Caroline, I want to add something about Brian Kelly because I know.
Yeah, please do.
That,
you know him well from his days at Cincinnati.
Yes, I do, for both good and bad reasons, because we all know how he left Cincinnati in 2009, which seems like a lifetime ago, but it happened. And a lot of people are still bitter about it in Cincinnati. Let me tell you something about Brian Kelly. And you said it best on my show earlier this week, that you said that Brian Kelly is the CEO of practice. Mm-hmm. That is a great thing to have, because here's something about Brian Kelly. He came to Cincinnati 2007 was his first year. And he was doing a radio show with Mo Egger, who's a Cincinnati sports radio
Cincinnati guy.
Yeah, love him. He's a mentor of mine. So, and I also a former colleague of mine. So, Mo Egger was wearing a Fort Worth bowl. I don't even know if that bowl game still exists. a Fort Worth Bowl pullover. And Brian Kelly got on him for wearing that at his radio show. Mo said that he never wore that pullover again. Why? Because Brian Kelly wanted nothing about the Fort Worth Bowl. He wanted everything up here. He wanted BCS. He wanted national championships. He took the and Bearcat fans can be bitter about the way he left, but damn it, he took the Bearcats from purgatory almost and just mediocre to 12-0 in 2009, and they were a illegal clock review away from playing for the national championship. Apparently, the Big 12 couldn't do clock reviews, I've been told, in 2009. So Cincinnati should have been playing for the national championship against Alabama in the Rose Bowl. Brian Kelly, Caroline, I do believe, and I'm going to hype up him. I'm going to hype up LSU here. He will have command of that football program at LSU. He will take LSU to 10-win seasons on the daily, whatever it's called, yearly, annually, whatever. He's going to have 10 wins a season. It may not happen this year, but it wouldn't shock me if it did. He's going to raise the bar. He's going to raise the expectations for LSU football because he knows LSU football is one of the most royal places of college football. Because I've been told, Caroline, and I'm sure you can attest to this, when there are 100,000 fans inside Death Valley, there's nothing like it. I've been told that, and I'm sure you can agree with me.
It's one of the most, or if not the most magical place in the whole entire world. I know I'm a little bit biased in saying that, but, when you got 102,321 people in there, it is absolutely electric. And I played a Paul Feinbaum clip earlier this week and kind of reacted to it. And Paul Feinbaum said the same thing, that just the organization of Brian Kelly is such a stark contrast from some of the coaching eras or some of the coaching staffs that we've had in the past. I think looking at the past couple of years at LSU, things have felt very jumbled, very unorganized. And it's felt like in Brian Kelly's only short time in Baton Rouge, it seems like all of that mess has been swept away. Everything's been tightened up. And like I said, very much so a CEO of practice. I texted a friend of mine whenever Brian Kelly was hired at LSU, who went to Notre Dame as a diehard Notre Dame fan. And I asked, what did we just get? How should I feel about this coaching hire? Because at the time, I really didn't know how to feel about it. And he said, you may not like him, but damn it, he wins. And you know what? At LSU, we just want to win. And those are the expectations: college football playoff, national championship. And, if he wins, that's all that matters.
All-time winningest coach in Notre Dame. He'll push the offense down the field. He'll push above. I mean, LSU may not have the most talented team in the SEC, but damn it, Cincinnati didn't have the most talent in the country in 2009, and they were the number 3 team in the country. And like I've said, this close to playing for a national championship. So he will make you believe anything is possible at LSU. I'm talking about beating Alabama in back-to-back years for the first time since I don't know when. That's what Brian Kelly is going to give you. I'm hyping him up here because I know, again, Cincinnati fans are bitter about how he left. But damn it, Cincinnati football wouldn't be where it is today without Brian Kelly. Fans were angry because Brian Kelly got them to the top and then they kind of fell back into mediocre and then purgatory. That's why Bearcats fans were upset, because they know that they've been there. It's what the top felt like. There's a book called that. This is what the top feels like, written by a good friend of mine, Bill Cook, about the 2009 season. That's why Luke Fickell's so revered, because he's gotten us back there and then some. And Brian Kelly will do the same thing for you down in Baton Rouge. There's going to be a lot of GEAUX chants, Go Tigers, coming out of Baton Rouge in the coming years. And I can't wait to see it, because I've grown up on LSU recently, because you've given us Corey Kiner, you've given us Joe Burrow, you've given us Jamar Chase. We chase the dream every single year in Cincinnati. Burrow and Chase. I forget where I bought the shirt. I bought it before the playoffs, but still.
I love it. I'm sure there's plenty of LSU fans who are going to be asking you for the link.
You know what? That's fine. Look, New Orleans is on my bucket list of cities and stadiums to go to, Caroline, and that's why I hope the Bengals-Saints game is not in London this year. So if any LSU fans want to reach out to me, I'd be more than happy to talk to them. And Caroline, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Proud LSU.
Yeah, appreciate you. And yeah, I think that I appreciate the hype. I think the listeners appreciate the hype as well, because I'm going into the season cautiously optimistic. It's hard to have expectations whenever you're coming in with a completely new coaching staff, but I think that this new coaching staff has only raised the bar, with such a shallow depth chart that we have at LSU. I think that we can all remain at least a little optimistic that we've got someone, in such control at that. But Alex, I appreciate you. Tell the people where they can find you.
So Locked On Bearcats, we are on YouTube, Locked On Bearcats on YouTube. You can subscribe and you can like and share comments on all videos. And of course, we're on all podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. So on audio and visual platforms, Locked On Bearcats. I'm planning Caroline to do something I don't normally do. I don't usually record at midnight because sometimes I'm exhausted when I come home from work, but damn it, it's the first round of the NFL draft. I am recording Friday's episode tonight at midnight, hopefully talking about 2 Bearcats going in the first round and just maybe one coming to a city near you in Nashville, Tennessee.
Maybe so. Desmond Ritter, but maybe potentially with the 26th pick for Tennessee Titans. Alex, we appreciate you and enjoy the draft tonight.
Caroline, same to you. Thank you for having me on, and best wishes to you and Locked On LSU.
Thank you. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. You can make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Ryan Tracy and the former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL Draft tonight to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and front offices. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast. In tomorrow's show, we will break down what happens tonight in the first round of the NFL Draft. Where does Derek Stingley go? There's also been a little bit of a shakeup with LSU basketball and the NCAA as well. We'll break that down on Friday's show. So I'll see y'all tomorrow.